All right, so Dalkin, I want to go in a different direction here.
Hmm.
I want to ask you, what are the different types of variables that you encounter in your work? And I want to talk about units of analysis. How do you identify them? And, what exactly is a unit of analysis? But we can start with different types of variables.
Okay. Um, in a lot of intervention-based research in the social and behavioral sciences, we typically try to think of independent and dependent variables first of all. What's my main independent variable? Typically, you just have one. You may have more than one, but and then what are the dependent variables or the outcome variables that you're interested in? If you're doing a randomized trial or a quasi-experimental trial type study, you typically want to isolate that independent variable. However, if you're doing more of a cross-sectional study, you may have a variety of independent variables and maybe just one outcome variable, for example, with a regression analysis or something. So it helps to to think about these variables in terms of what you can manipulate, what you can control, and what you cannot. And the independent variable is typically the thing that the researcher is able to manipulate and control versus the dependent variables. So, or it's the thing that you're trying to predict with the dependent variable is
Yeah.
the thing you're trying to predict with the independent variables. So that's the first distinction, is trying to come up with what you think are because that'll have an effect on how you write up your research questions and your hypotheses. You kind of need to have a good sense of what these variables are. I do a lot of studies that are psychometric in nature, and the variables that we use in psychometric studies are typically the items on the instrumentation, on the surveys. And so what I do in all of my field studies is I make sure that the data is collected at the item level, so that we have every single item on an instrument is recorded in the data file and not just the summary scores, because I use those individual items as variables in what we refer to as latent variable modeling. And we recently conducted a workshop, for example, here at UE on item response theory. We had a good turnout from.
I was there.
You were there?
Yes, I was there.
And we
Yes.
had participants from Cave Hill that were there. We had a variety of participants from the local business community here. And
And in academia, because you had a lot of psychologists, but you had me from HR. And
exactly.
so
Exactly.
it had a wide application.
It did. It does. Item response theory can have a very wide application. So it's appealing to people, and I've taught this workshop before. I've had people from biology and people from organizational behavior and business
Yes,
schools.
our OB PhD
Yes,
students
yes.
were there. Yes.
Yeah. So and the idea behind item response theory is that you're thinking about this one latent trait that you're trying to measure, and how well each item is measuring that latent trait in terms of the ability of the item to discriminate amongst individuals and how difficult that item might be. So, I worry a great deal about whether or not the instrumentation we're using works well, particularly when I'm using something new in a place like Jamaica or Barbados or Belize or Trinidad, because the cultures are different. And even in a study we're working on now, we're finding that measures that we would have expected would work the same across cultures, like just basic personality assessment measures. The items are not invariant across cultures, like just between Jamaica and Barbados. The items are working differently. So it's important to verify these assumptions that you're making up front with these studies with the kind of variables that you collect. So I make sure that I have this item level data so I can do these checks from culture to culture to see if the instrumentation is working the same way. We call it, that particular kind of study is called a measurement and variance study, to verify that the measures are indeed measuring those factors the same across culture.
What is a moderating variable? You spoke about independent and dependent. You have moderating and mediating variables.
Yeah, the basic idea behind a moderating variable, typically these are background variables that you collect data on. It could be sex, it could be ethnicity. We think of those as moderating variables. A lot of times they're binary type variables, so we try to even take continuous variables and turn them into binary variables just to look and see what the moderating effect is, or what we would refer to as an interaction effect. But a moderating variable is a variable that varies, or where it has differential prediction of the outcome based upon which group you happen to be in. So you might find that for example, males perform differently on some outcome of aggression than females if the predictor variable is, I don't know, I'm making it up, but if it's something else, you might find that relationship is different between males and females. You might have different regression lines for the two of them. So that's a moderating variable. A mediating variable is typically a variable that you would logically think is related to your outcome variable. It's a kind of variable that, as it says, it mediates the relationship between a predictor variable and the dependent variable. So let me see if I can think of something right now. If I had a dependent variable of happiness and my independent variable was, let's say it was let's say GPA in school, and how happy are you based upon your GPA in school? There's some correlation there between those two variables. One mediating variable might be the relationship that you have with your professors. And if you have a good relationship with your professors, that might mediate how happy you are based upon your GPA. You know, you could see how that there's kind of an alternative pathway between. It's not just a direct path between GPA and happiness. Your happiness may also depend on the kinds of individuals you have that are teaching you. So that would be a mediator.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm laughing because that for me is so true.
It is, yes. I think for most of us.
All right. So, what is a unit of analysis? How do you choose that? And how do you choose that?
Yeah, it in the social and behavioral sciences.
So that does have something to do with variables, right?
It does. It does. And it's a question you need to address with yourself in your own research early on. In the social and behavioral sciences, almost always the unit of analysis are individuals that we're wanting to study, because we're talking about people that make up populations that are of interest to us. So the unit of analysis is usually the individual. I have encountered some situations where the unit of analysis is more of an institutional level variable, like if we wanted to look at, there are large scale data sets that have individuals, there are individuals involved in a larger unit, like a school. You may want to look at, for example, what is the average, maybe we look at the average graduation rate at a variety of different universities, and the universities themselves become the unit of analysis. But I would say most of the time in the social and behavioral sciences, the unit of analysis would be the individual.
Okay. I know I tried something once where it was a dyad. I was looking at the relationship of the CEO, the head of the organization, and the HR person, to see how that affected the performance of the HR person. You know, so I was looking at the dyad because it's not just my behavior and absence, it's within the context of my relationship with the CEO.
Yeah, that can get more complicated. Often we have what's called the nesting effect with variables, where we'll have maybe even we're interested in the outcomes for all the individual students in a school, but all those students are nested within a classroom with a teacher, And you would expect that maybe within one classroom, things would be more similar than in another classroom because of the teacher effect that occurs in those two different classrooms. So we often do analyses that take into consideration the fact that that data is nested within this larger unit.
Okay. All right. So thank you.
You're welcome.